Support for First Coast Connect is provided in part by Baptist Health and North Florida TPO.
Can an endangered bird and an invasive mollusk offer hope for the future? Welcome to First Coast Connect. I'm Ann Schindler. Today, we meet the author of a new book who tracks one symbiotic relationship that has revised how we think about adaptation in the face of climate change. Later, a local land trust program makes home ownership possible by offering the land for free. But first, my guest today is a scientist and professor of environmental studies at Eckerd College. Her new book explores the complexity of conservation through an extraordinary bird, the snail kite. The book is titled The Kite and the Snail, An Endangered Bird, Its Unlikely Prey, and a Story of Hope in a Changing World. I'm joined now by author and researcher Hilary Flower. Hilary, thanks so much for being here today.
I'm so happy to be here, Anne.
I have to start off by saying I learned so much reading your book. It is just an extraordinarily fun read. It's a very genuine exploration. And I thought it was interesting. You come at this not really as a scientist, but as somebody with just a lot of curiosity about all aspects of this topic.
That's very true. So I am a scientist. I'm an Everglades scientist, but I'm not a bird person. I'm not a biologist. And so I really came at this with the excitement about the Everglades and concern about its future. But I was really new to I had to buy binoculars in order to start this book. So yes, I was very much learning as I went.
And you start off this book noting that the name of the bird, the snail kite, is something that causes confusion sometimes. So why don't we start there? What is a kite and where does the snail come in?
Right. So a kite is a class of birds that are just really graceful flyers, kind of like the toy. They got named, the name of the bird group kite came from the toy that flutters so effortlessly in the sky. And snail kites are one of the kites, and they are in the hawk and eagle family. And snail kites eat one thing. They eat apple snails. That's it. So much so that it's become their name, the snail kite.
These birds are extraordinarily rare. You write that they're only found in Central and South Florida, and you call them a specialist predator. Explain what that means.
I had to learn what that means too. So a specialist predator is very rare and they eat one thing. Like there are more specialist herbivores like koalas, they eat eucalyptus, pandas eat bamboo. Whereas predators tend to, maybe they specialize in, like small rodents or fish or other birds. But for snail kites, it's one thing, apple snails, not mollusks in general, apple snails. And because they have narrowed their prey base to one thing, they have adapted in all these really cool ways to specialize in that one thing. Like, for instance, their bill is hyper curved, and it's so that it can kind of function like a can opener and slip inside the apple snail's shell and pop it out so that they can get their meat. There you go. There's the hyper curved bill. So they are exquisitely adapted to forage this one thing.
So they can actually insert the bill into this snail shell. You say that they can use it to sever a muscle inside the snail shell. And
Yes.
Folks who are watching our live stream can see your depiction of that. So they've got this extraordinary skill, but it is very tailored to this one native apple snail that lives in the Everglades or lived in the Everglades. And that became a problem when that snail started to disappear.
Right. So it was a good evolutionary strategy for thousands of years because the Everglades was full of these snails. And when we started draining Florida and replacing some wetlands with agriculture, residential developments, the snails started to decline. And especially in the last 50 years, even the remnant Everglades is losing its native snails. So it really became a crisis for the snail kite because what had worked for millennia was no longer working in the way that humans had changed Florida.
And you get into some really fascinating information. You're an eco-hydrologist, which was a new term to
Yeah,
me. But you study water and its relationship to the natural environment, and you have
exactly.
such fascinating information about the Everglades. We were actually talking on this program about the politics of the Everglades a couple days ago, but in terms of the science of the Everglades and the water
Yeah.
function of the Everglades, it was really interesting to read about just some of the facts, these really astonishing
Mhm.
statistics. Talk a little bit about the age of the Everglades, because that really caught my interest in terms of how old it is relative to the human population of Florida.
Well, as a geologist, I think in millions of years. Even 1 million years is just like a second ago. Like, why even think about it, right? And in terms of the Everglades, it's been around for 5,000 years, just 5,000 years. And there were people on the peninsula of Florida 13,000 years ago at a time when the climate was cooler and drier. So as the Everglades became born, as the climate warmed and got wetter, human generations were here to witness it and participate in it. They actually, the indigenous people actually helped grow our tree islands, which are iconic in the Everglades.
And actually precipitated the Everglades by about 8,000 years, the indigenous
That's right.
populations of Florida, which is an amazing thing to think about. So
It
this
is.
waterway, the Everglades, is uh, dominated by what you describe as sheet flow water. It is, it's fed by, I think you say, some 5 feet of rain annually, which is a huge
Yes.
amount. But talk about how that flow happens over many, many miles.
So in the historical Everglades, something really strange happened. So as everyone knows, normally water will find little low spots and create a channel, and as it moves through, it'll dig that channel deeper. That's how we get valleys. That's how we get canyons. It's normal. But Florida's landscape was so flat, just unimaginably flat, that water had nowhere to really channel. And so it flowed like a sheet across South Florida from Lake Okeechobee all the way out to Biscayne Bay and Florida Bay and the Gulf. It just flowed out like a sheet, and it flowed shallowly and slowly enough, and it was very clear water that it could be vegetated throughout. Right? If it's a big current, vegetation gets uprooted. But in the historical Everglades, it's been called a river of grass. That's because the vegetation was pretty much throughout as the water just slowly moved through the landscape.
And so human activity in many ways kind of wrecked that. You say that we can draw a line in 1900 basically as a demarcation
Yeah.
of the evolution of the Everglades, or in some cases the de-evolution of the Everglades. There's a lot
Yeah.
that doesn't exist anymore, and that's largely because of these channelized waterways that take water from that traditional flow, which would now cover homes or agriculture, and we send it out east and west in channels.
That's right. Yeah, so the original idea was to redeem this wasteland land, right? So, if it's covered with water, what good is it to humanity? And so the idea was to do a good thing and drain it. So people put in roads and canals to allow the water to drain off the land so that it could be used for agriculture and human residences. Uh, and then in turn, the agriculture and the residences needed to not be flooded even in a wet year or in the wet season. So it just kind of flipped this enormous wetland on its head and really kind of turned it into a very managed wetland to the extent that it remains. And so it's segmented, it's fragmented, the flow is stopped by roads and levees. And so it's just fundamentally different. That even shallow flow has turned into canals and water conservation areas that are kind of used as reservoirs. So it's just fundamentally different.
And so that ecosystem has changed, and it impacts this native apple snail, which had is the largest freshwater snail in North America, but it began disappearing. And for the snail kite, this bird, which the snail comprises 99 plus
That's right.
percent of its diet, That's a real challenge. So what starts to happen?
Well, for a while, the snail kite and the native snail were holding their own in the remnant Everglades. And so Everglades National Park, especially the water conservation areas and the western marsh of Lake Okeechobee, had big nesting colonies of snail kites through the 80s and into the 90s. But as we changed the water management again, because it's highly managed, so we can decide how much water goes in and when through these water control structures. As we changed how we were managing that water, areas started to get too dry for the snails or too deep for the snails, and so the native snail began to decline, and the snail kite, it didn't have an alternative, and so it went from 3,000 snail kites in the late 90s to just a few hundred within a decade. So we were really worried that the snail kite was going to go extinct.
And this is a species that's been on the list of endangered species, was on the first list of
The
endangered
first one,
species. That was back in the late 60s.
yeah,
Um,
67.
yeah. And so it had some struggles previously. It was known to be in this endangered category, but you were spotting kites with your daughter in the Everglades for a period. They were dwindling. Then you sort of stopped seeing them, but other people started seeing them elsewhere. And this was sort of one of the things that got you going into this book, was to sort of find why that was happening, where they were going.
Yeah, my experience of Florida's nature before I started this project was, the little local wetlands near me in St. Petersburg, Florida, and then the Everglades. And I stopped seeing them in the Everglades. I think the last one I saw was around 2013. And so when I started this project in 2023, it had been a decade since I'd seen one. And in order to start this project, I figured the first step was to find a snail kite. Where are they now? And I had to, instead of driving south from St. Petersburg in the Tampa Bay area to the Everglades, I had to drive north 2 hours to the Gainesville area. Snail kites had started showing up in Paynes Prairie, which they historically they had a much broader range within Florida, but in the last century they were very much constrained to southernmost Florida. And so I knew I was going to be on a crazy adventure when finding snail kites meant driving north to Paynes Prairie.
If you're just joining us, we are talking to author and professor of environmental studies, Hilary Flower, about her new book, The Kite and the Snail. If you have questions or comments, you can join our conversation on air at 904-549-2937. You can also go to firstcoastconnect.org to find other ways to submit questions or comments. So, Hilary, an invasive species enters the picture. We talked about the native apple snail, which starts to decline. The bird population follows and also is in decline. And then this invasive version of the apple snail starts to boom. What impact did that have?
Well, at first we thought it was going to be the end of snail kites, in fact, because when the non-native snail first appeared, it gets a lot bigger than the native snail. And in fact, initially, it was only the big version that became available. It was along the edge of Lake Toho, and it was only this jumbo-sized snail. And so in a way, it was a boon because all of a sudden there were snails and they were large meals. But the snail kite, as that image that you showed demonstrates, their bill was evolved to go around the bend of a golf ball sized snail. Yes, not a softball sized snail. So sometimes they would catch a snail and they were having trouble getting the meat out. And sometimes they would even give up after an hour. And it was also heavier to carry. And so sometimes they would catch the snail and drop it before they could even attempt to get the meat out. So at first we thought that this was going to be the end of snail kites. And part of that too is that very often when invasive animals come along, they can do a lot of harm to native species. So again, at first it was like, okay, we've seen this we've seen this movie before. This invasive species is going to hurt the snail kite. That was the big worry when in around 2004, 2005, when the invasive snail started to boom.
You talk about the size of these snails and you describe the birds dropping these giant snails. But just to be clear, the native version is somewhat the size of like a ping pong ball,
Right.
a couple of inches across. These ones,
Hmm.
these invasive ones, could get as big as 6 inches in diameter, which it just seems, it kind of defies reason. And I feel like I remember headlines from that period where people were talking about these
Hmm.
giant apple snails, these invasive apple snails, and there was a lot of concern about it. I don't specifically remember that being drawn to the kites, but the worry declined as this bird started to adapt. How did that happen? And how did people realize it was happening?
Well, the main adaptation that they made was behavioral. So while we were, worried that they were going to decline, and we're watching them fumble these snails, and it was, we thought we saw evidence of harm. In fact, because the non-native snails were a meal that was 5 times more than the little snack they were getting from, like you said, the ping pong ball size native snails, when they did succeed in getting a meal from the non-native snail, it was a much bigger meal. So they actually started getting bigger, and the juvenile snail kites that were raised on a diet of these invasive snails, because the parent snail kites would bring snails to their babies in the nest. The babies grew bigger, and so they had a greater mass, they had a larger bill. They simply got bigger because they were suddenly being fed better, and in fact they had better survivability in 10 years. So it was a lifelong benefit, and this is research that came out of the University of Florida under Rob Fletcher. They did a lot of research on the different generations coming through of snail kites, the ones that were raised on native snails versus the ones raised on the invasive snails. And once they adapted to finding ways to get that meat out, they really started to flourish. And another adaptation, so they have so many, their ability to adapt is just stunning, and they're often adapting and behaving in ways we were not expecting. So one of them was, I mentioned that initially the non-native snails that became available were the softball size ones. Well, within a couple years, more size classes, because more age classes became available, and so the snail kites would hone in on the invasive snails that were the size of their familiar native prey. So they were size selecting, and they have an uncanny ability to find where the invasive snails are popping off somewhere in the state, and that becomes their nesting site that year. So, for instance, a farmer flooded their pasture one year, and boom, the invasive snails took off, and that became the second biggest nesting hotspot for snail kites that year, even though they never would have gone to that rancher's land in the past. But all of a sudden, there they are. They're ready to take advantage before we even know something has changed.
One of the things that interested you in pursuing this book was another adaptation that a lot of people initially marveled over, which was the change in the size of the beak in a very short period of time. And a lot of people were describing this as this rapid evolution that was happening, a Darwinian change instead of over centuries or millennia, happening almost overnight.
Yeah, and it turns out that can happen. If you have a sudden change in food availability, usually caused by a severe drought, for instance, in Darwin's finches in the Galapagos Islands, the bill of the finch changed in a single generation, and it was because all of the ones that didn't have the right bill size or shape died off. And so we thought that was going to happen potentially with the snail kites, because we were so worried that they were going to die off and starve to death in the face of these less accessible jumbo snails. And it's still possible that that's happening. Robert Fletcher from UF, who headed up the snail kite monitoring program, did a study that looked at that. That study concluded that it was phenotypic plasticity, which is simply that it didn't need to be caused by genetics. So it wasn't 100% clear that it had to be caused by evolution per se. But I think he still is thinking that that may be the bigger explanation. And with more, another decade of data that they now have, he could come out with another study that shows indeed that it was rapid evolution. So that's an unfolding story.
You offer a good example of that phenotypic plasticity, which is basically how in a culture where people are fed better, the children grow taller generally. And
Yeah,
so that can happen without necessarily it being an rapid evolutionary change.
that's right. Yeah. And so they were certainly fed better. And so there is an explanation that's available for the larger bill, especially since they also got larger leg bones and they got higher mass. So they just got bigger.
Yeah. So, in terms of the balance between an invasive species that we're trying to protect, excuse me, a endangered species that we're trying to protect, and an invasive species that has become its new food source, that creates complexity. You talk about how the health of the snail kite, the health of this bird, is sort of a barometer of the health of the Everglades in many ways, and the focus of a lot of efforts to save it. And yet, invasives are typically species that we try to eradicate. And this is one that the state has on different levels tried at different times to eradicate. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about the evolution of our view of this new giant apple snail.
Right. So the snail kite was used as one of the indicator species for Everglades restoration success because it was so tied to a healthy Everglades up until the point when the invasive snail came. So before that, if the Everglades was healthy and we got the water right, there were plenty of the native apple snails, and so the snail kites were prospering. And by 2012, the native snail had declined to such an extent that the uh, snail kite had declined, and the Everglades restoration got an F because of this indicator of, snail kites are down, so there's a problem with how we're managing the Everglades. Enter the invasive snail. It loves hydrilla. It loves invasive plants. It loves lakes that have lots of excess nutrients to feed the invasive plants. And so now, where you see snail kites living it up and having a blast and nesting and swirling around in the sky, it's a sign of an impacted wetland for the most part. That's where you see them, kind of almost swarming, is where the invasive snail has popped off, and that's where there's usually deeper water, more nutrients, more invasive plants. So if anything, the snail kite, for no fault of its own, is an index for an impacted wetland now. So it's really kind of completely changed its role in terms of as an indicator of restoration.
It's so interesting the way you describe it in your book, too, as essentially freeing the bird from their dependence on a healthy ecosystem, which essentially is the reality that this is a degraded
Mhm.
ecosystem. And the involvement of a plant like the hydrilla, which is an invasive, and the state spends a ton of money annually,
Millions annually.
yeah, trying to get rid of in a variety of ways, some ways that are in direct contravention of the health of this bird. So, if you can talk about how you learned about the eradication efforts, whether it was giant herbicide treatments or removal or drawdowns that dried out these, how was
Mhm.
that balanced against the health of this bird?
Well, it really threw a monkey wrench into our ordinary operating for managing a wetland, right? So before the invasive snail came along, invasive plant bad, right? It was simple. So whatever budget we had that we could throw at it, we should throw at it and get rid of as much of the invasive plants as possible. Obviously, right?
Right.
And in fact, when you initially said by accident, we're protecting this invasive species, in fact, we ended up having to, at times, protect hydrilla in order to protect the food base for the invasive snail, so that the snail kite, which was for many years nesting right where the hydrilla was, where that would be preserved. So Dr. Paul Gray of Florida Audubon, I'm sure he never came into his job expecting to be fighting to have plant managers hold off on hydrilla treatments, but in fact, there was a really big battle in 2008 where the snail kites were nesting on Lake Toho, and Lake Toho was overgrown with hydrilla. It was a big problem for many people and many organisms, and yet near the nesting area, snail kite advocates were begging the state to hold off on the hydrilla treatment. So all of a sudden, invasive plants become a tool for saving an endangered species, which really shows not that invasive species are good across the board. Obviously, they've done a lot of harm, and that's how they get the name invasive species. In fact, the Burmese pythons, which a lot of people are familiar with now, caused mid-sized mammal populations in the Everglades to decline by 99%. So it's astonishing how much harm some invasive species can do. So I don't mean to downplay that at all. But the snail kite story really pushes us to be more situation specific and less kind of black and white about how we address invasive species.
And how do you make the choice? I don't mean you personally, but generally speaking, this case where we're talking about protecting this bird, the fight ultimately came down to, can the state do something that harms an endangered species? That's a violation of the Endangered Species Act, and that proved to be the thing that, caused some of these large scale treatments, herbicide applications, to be held off on or constrained somewhat. But why does the bird take precedence in this case when you're up against two very potentially damaging invasives, hydrilla and this snail?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll tell you, it usually doesn't take precedence. I think in that particular case in 2008, Nat Reed was a very vocal environmental advocate. He was someone who had helped write the Endangered Species Act, and he came to Florida, fell in love with the snail kites, and he was hopping mad that they were going to go forward with this hydrilla treatment. So I think it was kind of a perfect storm of backlash from within the environmental movement, so that it caused a stepping back. And so in 2011, 2008, they did kind of go forward with the treatment, and so it kind of affected snail kites, but not as bad as it would have. But 2011, they held way back on the hydrilla treatments, and snail kites had a banner year for nesting on Lake Toho. So that was a big success. Very often, when decisions are made around water management in Florida, there are really important competing interests on the human side. One is water supply. So in places, for instance, Lake Okeechobee and some of the water conservation areas, water is kept too high for ecological health, but it means more water supply and more flood control. So it gives our agencies more latitude if some of these areas can be essentially used as reservoirs, but that's at the expense of the ecosystem. And so I was really confused why, for instance, in 2011, it was a bad drought. Snail kites did well on Lake Toho because of the hydrilla, but around the rest of their habitat, they were suffering. And they had started nests in the western marsh of Lake Okeechobee, but as water levels dropped, they were water managers were going to put in forward pumps to kind of get the last bits of water out for agriculture. And Florida Audubon fought it, and they ended up installing those pumps. The water dried down too quickly, and a lot of those nests failed. And I could not understand how that could happen, because here was a critically endangered bird. That was at a time when it had lost 75% of its population in a single decade. But because it is a species that can move around the state, when snails are good over here, snail kites very quickly move over there, you can no longer say this particular spot is essential for their survival as a species. So it creates, their adaptability actually creates this giant loophole for kind of sliding around the Endangered Species Act, because you can't say, oh, well, they have to have this western marsh of Lake Okeechobee, because, you know, if snails are good in Payne's Prairie even, then they can go up there. So very often there are ways for the human agendas to take an outsized role, I think, in compared to the ecological costs for a lot of species. And I'll just add that the places where the snail kite is no longer living because the water conditions are not good for it, we don't have wading birds. We don't have a lot of the species that were thriving alongside the snail kite. So the snail kite's needs are really indicative of the larger needs of the ecosystem.
Just briefly, because we are going to have to wrap this, we're in the middle of a major drought right now. Is this success story of this symbiotic relationship going to change again?
One thing that I have learned from following the snail kites is they will always surprise us. And part of that's their exquisite adaptability, and part of that's their vulnerability. So yes, they've been surviving on this invasive snail, but it really has to have an explosion somewhere. Conditions have to be perfect for that invasive snail to explode in order for there to be a nesting super site for the snail kites. So they are still relying on this kind of uncertain event scenario for them to keep going each year. So this is a very dry year. They've been eating turtles, which is, they really can't survive long on turtles. So it's a scary year, and we really need the wet season rains to come early, or this is going to be a very bad year for the snail kite. But again, they're always surprising us. So it's always a fascinating story to watch as it unfolds in real time.
Well, Hilary Flower, it's a great book. It's called The Kite and the Snail. Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much.
All right. Up next, free land was supposed to make homes more affordable. We talk about a challenge and recent success of the Jacksonville Community Land Trust. Welcome back. A local housing nonprofit celebrated a milestone last month with a ribbon cutting on its inaugural home. Here to tell us about their approach to making housing more affordable is Jacksonville Community Land Trust Executive Director Robin Falsgraf. Robin, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having us.
We're also joined by Miguel Milla, General Manager with Land Trust partner Flight Builders. Good morning, Miguel.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Great. I'm glad to have you both. So, Robin, first of all, what is the concept of a land trust? I feel like we hear about this in natural lands, environmental land trusts, but how does it work when we're talking about affordable housing?
What the premise of the land trust is to separate the dirt from the house. So our homeowners own their house, but not the dirt. We own that, and we retain a ground lease. It's not because we want to own their property, but it's because we can then guarantee it stays affordable housing forever.
So the land is given essentially for the use of this house, but you retain ownership, or does the city retain ownership?
We retain ownership. We're an independent nonprofit that started by being formed by the city because they found the need. As we know, many affordable houses, when the person is ready to sell, it becomes a rental income for an investor, and that takes that out of the affordable housing market. So this was a mechanism where the city could say so many houses in neighborhoods are going to be permanently affordable.
And so these projects are built on land that is leased on a 99-year renewable lease.
Yep.
The homeowner buys the home, they pay the mortgage, and by not having to pay for the land, it becomes more affordable.
Yeah, that's a big factor.
What is
in
the
our program.
taxing situation?
They do not pay tax on the land. They only pay it on their house.
Okay, very clear. And so obviously affordable housing, neighborhoods where housing is in decline are often vulnerable to changes, people being displaced. How do you ensure that people aren't using the home for a rental or in fact to sell it or to profit off it in some way as an Airbnb?
Yes, they are not allowed to do that.
Okay.
So again, we don't want to take anyone's home away, but we have the mechanism to say you must occupy it. So when they're ready to move, they move, and the house gets sold to somebody else. That's how we keep that control through the ground lease.
Okay. I want to talk more about sort of the process and the timeline, but I want to bring Miguel into the conversation. You are a partner with the Land Trust. What is it? First of all, why? What does your company gain from partnering with the Land Trust, and what role do you actually play?
Sure. So we believe that affordable housing is really a key to like mental health that's going across the nation. And when people have a safe place and a stable place to live at, that we can help solve that. And that's just our part of helping solve that issue there. And what does it do when a child has a home to live in that is safe and stable? So affordable housing is near and dear to our heart, and that's why we partner in with people like the Land Trust.
And so what do you actually do in this partnership?
So we build it. So Robin brings the land to us, and we design the plans, we do the development of it, and then we actually build the vertical construction of it for the Land Trust.
And where does the money come from?
We fund it, you know what I mean? And then they pay us back through their sale of the property and stuff like that. So,
Okay, great.
you know.
So let's talk about the timeline. This is a program that was started under the former mayor, Lenny Curry. It had some money, some city money behind it, about $250,000, but it's this nonprofit public-private partnership. And it followed a state law that required that city governments basically offer surplus land in the name of affordable housing before getting rid of it in some other fashion. And so this was the first organization in Florida that was a first look agency. Basically, you get to look at this property that the city has reclaimed for some reason, maybe taxes or liens, and decide whether or not you want it. So how many parcels were you able to acquire, and what is the status of those parcels?
We started out with, I think, 19 total. The status is we are developing. We're planning, we're taking homeowners, we're matching what they can afford, coming up with a plan with Flight's partnership that's in their affordability. I was telling Miguel, we work backwards, kind of. We meet that person, we find out where that is, and then we try to gap and fund to get it where they can comfortably afford it.
And that's what you did in this case. There was some down payment assistance for your new homeowner. There was some funds available, and so he ultimately ends up getting a very affordable property for a new home. He's a homeowner. He says he's going to be paying around $900 a month, which is cheaper than many rents.
This house would rent for at least $2,500. And I've asked a lot of people, what would this house rent if it was a rental? And everyone says at least $2,500. So for our first homeowner, he's not going to pay $2,500 if he's even capable, which he really isn't. And now he can own a home for that.
Yeah. So has this process been harder than you anticipated?
I was just telling someone when they offered me this job, I was living in the Midwest, and the gentleman from the Florida Housing Coalition said, Robin, it'll be 3 years, and I said, oh, it won't be 3 years. And guess what? It was 3 years before we got the first home built. So much for what I knew.
And why is that the case?
It's been a great challenge. I told Miguel first, there was kind of a mindset I felt here that we had to charge at least a minimum of like $220. And I said, we don't have to charge $220 because I've come from construction. We don't have to do that. And telling people that we're not competing with any other nonprofit or for-profit. We're doing our own thing. We're helping a whole different segment of the population. And there's been a little challenges. It's been a lot more political kind of things than I expected. But I'm very confident in what we're doing. And I was very excited at the ribbon cutting to say, this is what we can do and make it affordable. So
let me just play devil's advocate for a minute.
Yeah.
If we're going to look at a timeline from 2022 to 2026 and money from the city that was in the range of $250,000, could not we have gotten a homeowner faster just by buying a home for that person as opposed to going through this whole long process?
Well, it took us a while. We had to get the nonprofit status. That takes some time. Then we had to, we have to set ourselves up. I say, if we don't have the legs of the chair isn't going to stay. So we've spent strategically placing how are we going to do this. To build one home and say, hey, we can't do it anymore, doesn't make a difference. But to build the foundation well and then start building up, I'm very happy with where we are. It's been a rough 3 years, but I'm very excited.
So what is the pace going to be like now? Do you anticipate, now that you've cut your first ribbon, that there is going to be a faster access to these homes or more homes available?
Yes, I'm very excited to say we believe we'll be on a 5-month turnaround. So when someone's approved now, I think we're in the position that we can build them a home in 5 months.
Wow. Okay. So when do you think that'll happen?
I think we're planning the next 3 right now. So I think we'll be doing, we won't do a ribbon cutting with every house, but we'll be putting 3 new homeowners in this summer.
And so what does it mean, Miguel, for your company when you see somebody actually take occupation of this home? Is it something that you are, just emotionally, how does it feel to see that happen?
Oh, it feels great. I mean, when you see a new home on a new block, pop up where the homes are, 70, 80 years old, and you see the transformation starts to take on that street, and the way that people respond to it on that street is amazing. I mean, it's very emotional. The new home does for that, and the people that come into those homes.
Yeah. And Robin, if people are interested in the program, what are the rules? How do they apply?
People must be at 80% or less than the median income. That's our mandate. We have to do that. And then they call our office. We give them an application. The land trust only screens for income. But we do know that we then send them to our financial partner. We've had a great relationship with Ameris Bank. Ameris is very good to our homeowners. Ameris will say, you're ready. And then they do 8 hours of the new homeowner education. Or we say, you're not quite ready, but we're going to set you up with somebody who will help you get ready.
Yeah. Well, it is an interesting program. We look forward to sort of staying abreast of it as you all progress. But we are glad to have you, Miguel. Robin, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
All right.
Absolutely.
Up next, as the state slashes AIDS funding, locals gather to remember the human costs of the illness. We meet one of the organizers of the First Coast AIDS Walk after the break.
Congaree & Pen, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpen.com. Terrell Hogan Law.
I'm Wayne Hogan. Highway, hospital, home, work. Where injuries happen can make a difference in the law and the outcome.
More at terrellhoganlaw.com.
Film at WJCT presents Do the Right Thing, set on the hottest day of the summer for tickets.
Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has called the U.S.-Israel war against Iran a religious war. Secretary of State Marco Rubio justified the strikes by saying Iran is run by religious fanatic lunatics. As more lawmakers frame the conflict around religion, concern is also growing over Christian nationalism in the military. Is this conflict in Iran turning into a religious war? Next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. An annual event seeks to educate the community on HIV/AIDS prevention, testing, and treatment while honoring lives lost to the disease. Here to tell us is one of the organizers of the First Coast AIDS Walk, Chris Day. He's also the board president of Friends of the Quilt. Chris, thanks for being here this morning.
Hey, good to be here. Thanks for having me.
So this is an event that has been held annually. This year, it is being held with special memory to somebody that was very important in the local community. Tell us a little bit about Dick Neiman and what role he played.
Yeah, that's right. So Dick Neiman was a longtime HIV/AIDS advocate here in Jacksonville, Florida, and we lost him recently. He was actually one of the original board members for a nonprofit, North Florida AIDS Network. It's one of the longest running HIV/AIDS nonprofits here in Northeast Florida. And it's really because of him that we stand on his shoulders and we continue the mission that we're doing today.
Did a lot of work in destigmatizing, in being an advocate, being very vocal. And as you say, it's the standing on his shoulders because the conversation has come a long way since then. But as we alluded to earlier in the program, there have been a lot of cuts recently that have imperiled funding for people who rely on AIDS medication to stay healthy and to keep their HIV in check. So how is the community reacting to that change and receiving the news that some of those steps are perhaps being undone?
Yeah, it's I think there's maybe a little bit of confusion, a lot of hesitation, a lot of concern around it. Medication and support for people who have HIV/AIDS has really come a long way, but what continues to pain us a little bit is just that access to care. If you're an underserved individual, financially unstable, getting that access to care is really, really important. And so ADEP programs or other kind of supportive programs are really critical to connecting people to care. And we know that's important. It gets people into viral suppression and really stops transmission of the disease.
And so an event like this is a cause for the community coming together. It's celebratory, but it's also, got this honoring element. And so what is it who participates generally? Who do you invite to come? What does it look like overall?
Yeah, no. First Coast AIDS Walk will happen this Saturday on March the 14th. Registration opens at 8:30. We welcome anyone and everyone who wants to kind of celebrate and lift up our community. And that is the community of Northeast Florida, Jacksonville, whether you're remembering somebody who you lost to HIV/AIDS, supporting someone who has HIV/AIDS, maybe you're working in a nonprofit or working at a doctor's office and want to be seen in the community, or really just kind of family oriented. It's a great opportunity to come out and support the community. It will be at A. Randolph Park. And it's really kind of fun for everyone. We have a dedication, an opening prayer. The walk is about a little less than 1 mile, so anyone can participate in it. We'll have live music, food trucks, and it's a little bit of a mix of the walk, education, and also, as you say, celebration.
And so for people who have information that you want to dispense, what kind of organizations representing HIV/AIDS education or prevention will be represented there?
Yeah, we'll have a number of organizations there. Our key sponsor this year is Reza Ride, which also does a great job at raising funds for not only just HIV/AIDS nonprofits, but other nonprofits in the community. We'll have other organizations like North Florida AIDS Network, like UF Cares, and many other organizations that are there, not only just from the nonprofit community, but also there are other small businesses that like to show up at these events and offer kind of their support and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's obviously a critical time. We mentioned that you are also affiliated with the Friends of the Quilt. Tell us a little bit about that project and what it is that you do with that organization.
Yeah, so Friends of the Quilt, as a nonprofit here in Florida, has been around for many, many years. And our main focus is HIV/AIDS awareness and advocacy and support, kind of reducing barriers to care, helping people who have been recently diagnosed, get connected to care, get access to medications and things like that. Our connection to the quilt, we do a lot of work with the AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is located in San Francisco. It's one of the largest folk pieces of art in the world. And so we transport sections of the quilt between San Francisco and Jacksonville, Florida, to basically show, connect people to the story of HIV/AIDS and the profound impact that it's had on people's life and remembrance.
It is an extraordinary piece of art and memory for sure. So the First Coast AIDS Walk is Saturday. It is starting, as you said, at 9:15 at A. Philip Randolph Heritage Park. We've got a link on our website. Chris Day, thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right. And that is our program. Thank you for listening. We encourage your feedback or suggestions. You can leave either at firstcoastconnect.org. First Coast Connect is produced by Stacy Bennett. Our associate producer is Isabella Casapow. Our show is directed by Brady Coram, and our theme music is performed by Club de Belugas. Join us tomorrow when we discuss the grassroots push to formalize a neighborhood Bill of Rights. I'm Ann Schindler. You've been listening to First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO.
The North Florida TPO is dedicated to transportation planning, funding, clean fuels, and new technologies for a vibrant, resilient, and connected region. More information available at northfloridatpo.com. Baptist Health is a proud supporter of First Coast Connect. Baptist Health, committed to building a healthier community for all of us. More info at 202-4YOU or baptistjacks.com. The Florida Theater presents Pat Metheny. The jazz guitarist, composer, and bandleader brings his Side Eye 3+ tour to Jacksonville on Tuesday, March 17th at 8 p.m. Tickets and information available at floridatheater.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Up next, national and local news from NPR and the WJCT News team.